Why do people suffer in hell? If hell even exists in the first place, why should it be such a horrible place? Why is this the nature of reality in Christian theology? Depending on who you talk to, Christians will explain the existence of a torturous hell in one of two ways. The first is that hell is really just separation from God, which is why it just so happens to be a horrible place, since God is all things good. Presumably, this means that if God were all things bad, then hell would actually be a nice place. It's not supposed to be horrible, at least not for us. It just happens to be horrible.
Now Jesus said in Matthew 25:41 that hell was prepared for the devil and his angels. He never intended for man to go to this horrible place. It was prepared for the devil. But the reason hell is so terrible is because God has removed His goodness or His attributes from hell. You see, James 1:17 says every good and perfect gift comes down from above, from the Father of lights. So all the good we enjoy in life comes from God. It's not automatic. So what God did in the preparation was He simply removed His goodness. You see, hell is dark because 1 John 1:5 said God is light.
The only response I'd like to present to this idea is simply to ask the question, if God can see that a person's soul is destined for hell, why wouldn't God simply annihilate that person's soul before it goes to hell? If God really doesn't want people to go there, and if it really is that horrible, surely a loving God would simply annihilate those souls rather than having them suffer for eternity. The other explanation they give for why hell is so horrible is just the opposite. It's not that sinners just so happen to go to hell, which just so happens to be horrible. No, they have to go to hell to be punished for disobeying the ultimate authority. It's not just what does happen, it's what should happen. This is often explained with the analogy of a judge sending someone to prison.
If we look at that kind of judge, the Almighty Creator God, He can't just say, well, you've done all of these good deeds, so therefore I let you off. You must be punished for your crimes that you've committed against God, because every crime deserves a punishment.
You know, some people say God is mean for making hell, and even sadistic for allowing someone to suffer for all eternity. But remember, the God you are accusing of being mean is the same God that died a horrible death on the cross to keep us out. What more would you want Him to do? Secondly, you wouldn't say the leaders of our country are mean for constructing prisons. No, it's our choice. We don't have to go there.
Let's roll with this analogy. Let's ask ourselves, why do we send criminals to prison? Well, it seems to me that there are at least three main reasons why we send criminals to prison, which could also apply to this conception of hell, but which ultimately don't. Number one, it removes the person from society to protect everyone else. Number two, it deters the person from committing future crimes. And number three, it deters other people from committing crimes, because they can see that the punishment is not an empty threat. So let's take a look at how God's prison works. Let's see if sending sinners to hell really is analogous to sending criminals to prison. Reason number one, it removes the person from society to protect everyone else. In the case of sin and God's cosmic prison, I can agree that it would be important to remove sinners from society, that is, Earth, because that's where sinning has consequences. Life on Earth is basically one big test to see where you'll spend eternity. However, sinners are already being removed from society by dying, so it really doesn't matter where they go afterward, or even if they go nowhere and simply get annihilated. They're already unable to harm other people by influencing them towards sin, because they're dead. Sending sinners to hell does not protect anyone on earth the way sending criminals to prison does. The criminals, in this case, are already dead. They're already removed from society. There's no point sending them anywhere. So what about reason number two? It reduces the person's chances of committing future crimes. Well, the thing is, dead sinners are never getting back to earth, so there's no point in trying to deter them from sinning in the future, since they'll never get that chance. Unless, of course, it's possible to continue sinning in hell, and those sins have consequences, and those consequences can be mitigated by sinning less while you're in hell. I guess this is possible, but it's not a viewpoint I've heard expressed by many Christians, if any. That being said, William Lane Craig does actually mention this idea of continued sin in hell, but it's the most horrible, impractical catch-22 imaginable, and I can't fathom how a loving and rational God could possibly tolerate what Craig describes. This is Craig defending the idea that hell is an infinite punishment for what seems to be a finite number of sins.
If a person commits an infinite number of sins, then the sum total of all such sins deserves infinite punishment. Now, of course, nobody commits an infinite number of sins in the earthly life. But what about in the afterlife? Insofar as the inhabitants of hell continue to hate God and reject Him, they continue to sin, and so accrue to themselves more guilt and more punishment. In a real sense, then, hell is self-perpetuating. In such a case, every sin has a finite punishment, but because sinning goes on forever, so does the punishment.
Now, I can certainly understand why a person in hell would react this way, but this is the most impractical and senseless vision of hell I've ever heard, although it's not without parallels in our own prison system. Unfortunately, it's not uncommon that a person will go to prison for something relatively minor and then come out even worse suited for society than when they went in, leading them to engage in further criminal activity which lands them back in prison. Our prisons, much like Craig's idea of hell, can be self-perpetuating. However, we humans recognize that this is a problem, that it's unfair, impractical, and something we need to fix about our prisons. But apparently, God thinks this is exactly how prisons should operate. That, or He is unable to do anything about it. Pick your poison. Okay, but what about reason number 3? It deters other people from committing crimes. Well, maybe it would, except for the fact that the people who are still alive on Earth don't actually get to see the suffering in hell, so they have no way of knowing if the threat of hell is even real or not. Investigative reporters don't come back from hell. The Bible even says that people on earth will not receive any first-hand evidence of hell. The story of the rich man and Lazarus in Luke makes this abundantly clear. So the actual suffering in hell doesn't do anything to deter living people from sinning. Of course, God could still use the threat of suffering in hell to deter sinning, but hell itself wouldn't actually need to be a place of suffering in order for this to work, since no one on earth will ever see it and realize that it's an empty threat. And just like that, we've run out of reasons. As we can see, there doesn't appear to be any actual reason for people to suffer in hell, and the analogy of God and hell with a judge and prison simply makes no sense. One other argument I hear from Christians who make this analogy is, well, it's the fair thing to do. Is it though? Strictly speaking, the fair thing to do would be to, well, do unto the sinner as they did unto God. Maybe you'd brainwash the sinner's kids to break ties with them and to do things that the sinner thinks are immoral. Maybe have them join the KKK or something. That way the sinner experiences more or less what God experienced. That would seem to be the fair thing to do, but that's not what God supposedly does. Even if we grant the idea that God sending people to hell is the fair thing to do, why does that mean that it's what God ought to do? There are plenty of things that would be fair, which we don't do. We don't subject criminals to the same crime they committed, even though that would be the fair thing to do. We don't have everyone pay the same dollar amount in taxes, even though that would arguably be the fair thing to do. Heck, we don't even make people pay the same percentage in taxes, which is also arguably the fair thing to do. We have a progressive tax scale because we've realized that it's generally the most practical and sustainable way to fund a government. We also don't send clinically insane people to a regular prison for their crimes, even though that would technically be fair, since doing so would not be productive or useful. What this tells us is that something being fair doesn't necessarily mean that it's what we ought to do. It seems to me that fairness is, and generally should be, subordinate to practicality, and as we've seen, sending sinners to hell is completely non-practical. The idea that sinful people should go to hell is simply unjustifiable. As far as I can tell, Christians who profess this view of hell are simply trying to satisfy their instinctive desire to hurt the people who they don't like. I'm sorry, I mean the people who God doesn't like. Funny how God always seems to hate the same people you do.